Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to visit me. My name is Edward T. Sheldon. Evergreen Cemetery has been my final resting place for well over 100 years now. During my 73 years on this earth, I led a pretty diverse life. I was college educated, a captain during the Civil War, a blacksmith, a farmer, a cattle rancher, an educator, a legislator, but probably most notably, I was a conductor on the famous Underground Railroad. Well, I'll talk a little bit about that part of my life shortly, but first, let me give you just a brief overview of my life and what brought me here to the Pikes Peak region. I hope you find it interesting and entertaining. I was born in the small town of Berea, Ohio, February 28, 1838, and went to college there for 3 years. In 1862, when I was 24 years old, I moved to Iowa and enlisted as a private in the early years of the Civil War. Although I was only in the military for a short time, I saw lots of action and lots of battles. I was promoted from private to second lieutenant and then to captain. That same year, 1862, I married Miss Imogene Hammond. In 1864, after my military service, we moved back to Tabor, Iowa, and led a pretty quiet rural life there for about 10 years. Then, in 1874, tragedy struck. My beloved Imogene passed away. Moving on with my life, I remarried the following year to Miss Mattie Hobbs. We continued living in Tabor for about 5 years and eventually had 6 children of our own. You can see that 2 of my children, Gladys and Willard, share this final resting place with me along with Mattie. Does anybody know what happened here in Colorado along about 1879? It was the Colorado silver boom, about 20 years after the Colorado gold rush. And does anybody know about where silver was discovered in 1879? It was discovered near what is now Leadville. At the time, the settlement was called Slabtown, which always kind of reminded me of where we are now instead of the name of a real town. But the name was eventually changed to Leadville to commemorate the enormous amount of lead that was mined along with the silver ore. Mattie and I moved there in 1880, only a short time after silver was discovered, and already the population was about 40,000 people. We stayed there about 3 years. I did some blacksmithing and some other enterprises to take advantage of the booming economy there. It was once said that at that time there were no poor people in Leadville, and I think that's probably true. All told, the mines there produced about $500 million worth of silver ore, which they tell me in today's dollars is about $500 billion. But as in all other economic frenzies, it'll eventually cool down, and that's what happened in Leadville. In 1883, Mattie and I decided that we wanted a fresh start, and we decided on moving to South Dakota. We ended up in Hand County, South Dakota. I was able to obtain a small parcel of government land and eventually started a farming operation there, did quite well, and it eventually grew to well over 500 acres. And we stayed in South Dakota clear up until 1909. And at that time, we decided that we wanted to come back here to Colorado. But since I was already 70 years old at the time, I really didn't want to go back to a town that was over 2 miles high. So we decided to come here to Colorado Springs. Part of that decision was because my brother-in-law, Mattie's brother, was a practicing judge here in Colorado Springs. Now at that time, the Springs consisted of about 28,000 people, mostly congregated in Old Colorado City and the greater downtown area. I bought a house on South 16th Street between what's now Colorado Avenue and Kuchara Street. They tell me that the house is still standing and still looking pretty good. I went back to a former occupation of buying and selling cattle, and I did really quite well at it. I was quite successful. But as fate would have it, I was stricken with a very serious illness. In only 2 short years, my once strong body gave out. I passed away on December 29th, 1911, which happened to be the same day that Maddie and I shared as our 36th wedding anniversary. 4 days later, I was interred right here. That kind of gives you a real brief overview of my life and death and what brought me here to the Pikes Peak region. But let me go back some years and talk very briefly about my time with the Underground Railroad. As you probably already know, the Underground Railroad was an informal network of people and places that helped escaped slaves escape from slavery. It was active since the late 1800s, but was most active, the late 1700s, but it was most active between 1830 and 1860, the 30 years prior to the Civil War. Now, it was neither underground nor was it actually a railroad, just a secret group of people and places. Because of the secrecy involved, code words were very typically used. For instance, a person who helped an escaped slave, a freedom seeker, actually find freedom was called a conductor. That's what I did. I was a conductor. A place where an escaped slave could find safety or food or maybe a bed was typically referred to as a station, and the slaves themselves were typically called cargo. Because all activity on the Underground Railroad was highly illegal at the time, the federal government was mandated to impose severe fines and imprisonment on conductors or anyone helping slaves escape to freedom. If we go clear back to 1860, when I was just 22 years old and 2 years before I enlisted in the infantry, I was living in Tabor, Iowa, and working as a conductor on the railroad. Tabor was well known at that time for being sympathetic to freedom seekers, and many of the local townspeople were involved with the railroad. In March of 1860, 4 escaped slaves left the Cherokee Indian Territory in northern Georgia and made their way to Tabor seeking freedom. I and another local gentleman, who was also a conductor, were tasked with helping the 4 escape to freedom. We left Tabor on a Friday night, fairly late, and made it a good distance before we stopped to rest. Unfortunately, when we stopped, we were discovered. Warrants were quickly issued, the 4 slaves were detained, and my fellow conductor and I were arrested. But unlike today, justice was pretty swift in those days, and we were scheduled for trial the following day, even though it was a weekend. The trial was well attended by freedom sympathizers, and after a grueling 12-hour courtroom drama, we were finally acquitted and released. With a lot of help, we were able to reunite with the 4 slaves, and we did help them escape to freedom. Well, that's kind of a real brief overview of my life and death and what brought me here to the Pikes Peak region. Stories about occurrences on the Underground Railroad have been told and retold for well over 100 years, but only recently have they become documented. The U.S. National Park Service in 1998, many years after my death, started the Network to Freedom Project. The purpose of that project is to coordinate preservation and education efforts surrounding the railroad and its history. They're developing a list of facilities, sites, and programs that have a verifiable association with the Underground Railroad. To be nominated, or to be part of the project, a facility has to be nominated and go through a pretty lengthy application and approval process. The Park Service only accepts and approves applications twice a year, in January and July. Because of my association with the Underground Railroad, and because this is my final resting place, this cemetery has been nominated to become part of that project by an honors high school history class in Arlington, Nebraska, as part of the class project. That application is currently working its way through the approval process. Although there are lots of official Underground Railroad sites throughout the United States, if approved, Evergreen Cemetery will be the only such official site in the whole state of Colorado. Something we can be pretty proud of. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm 179 years old and I'm kind of tired. Thanks for listening to the story of my life and death. I hope you enjoyed it. My memory's not what it used to be, but I'll try and answer any questions that you might have.
We just have time for a couple.
Yes?
How long did you live in Leadville? Did you have any children?
I was in Leadville for 3 years, and I figured 6 was enough. So I didn't have any more then. But we were there from 1880 to 1883.
So you knew Tabor then?
Not personally. Not personally. I knew I was the roommate of the son of John Brown. There were some historical figures that I knew, but a lot of them that I'd heard of but didn't know personally.
Did you have children with your first wife?
No, no children. All our children were Maddie and I.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Captain
you.
Sheldon.